Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year to all of our clients, associate members and guests. My name is Clint Indrell, Managing Director of On Demand HR. Every Friday, now at 10 a.m, we're going to be presenting a different HR and IR topic. As you would have seen last year, we presented, I think, 14 topics leading up into Christmas, and we hope that we provided you some useful insights into various different HR and workplace relations issues for you to consider in your businesses or to consider with your clients when having discussions with them. Let us know of any future topics of interest that you would like. We're always looking for direction on what it is that clients and businesses want, what they want us to talk about, and happy to look at those for future segments. If you're watching live today or anytime after this video, please, if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the comments box and we'll be happy to take them either on the fly live or happy to respond to you after the session. So the whole purpose of HR Fridays, as we've said numerous times last year, it's trying to provide businesses, other organisations and professional advisors and our associate members with information which is a true lay of the land. We're trying to stop the noise and the scare tactics you might hear from other advisors who are just trying to sell you a product or a service. So that's the purpose of this segment. We've been in the Fair Work Commission many times. We've done many workplace investigations. We dealt with the Fair Work Ombudsman many times. So this allows us to provide real perspective, not just theory. If you want to see more about what we do and what we offer, www.ondemandhr.com.au. Today's topic is going to be looking at masks and vaccinations in the workplace. So very topical stuff at the moment. Many businesses thinking about this sort of thing, how they're going to deal with this in the time ahead. Obviously, this is a very early stage to be talking about this, but we thought best to get ahead of it before businesses and organisations that we are dealing with make mistakes on these particular things. So I've also got Andrew Kalida on standby today who might actually assist us in the stream if necessary. He's been working with me a lot to get together today's information. So once again, if you've got any comments, feel free to talk to us during the session. Let's get cracking and let's get into the material today. So first and foremost, can I direct an employee to wear a mask? So I think there's a couple of things here on this particular one. We've got, first of all, a definition from Safe Work Australia on this, and what it says is that you can direct a worker to wear a face mask if you, in consultation with those workers, decide it is necessary to minimise the risk of exposure to the COVID-19 virus. Interesting kind of definition there. It's a little bit of a sort of a buck each way. It talks about you can direct in consultation if it's necessary to minimise the risk of exposure. Well, you can make that argument for any industry, really. Regardless of whether or not you're one of the key industries that potentially has higher at-risk components because of the nature of the work being carried out, I think there is an argument for anyone to wear a face mask under that kind of definition. So that is certainly something that will be interesting to see and whether that evolves over time. So we think there is an obligation to provide three things. So first of all, provide adequate training on how to wear, remove and dispose of masks, good hand hygiene, washing your hands, etc., and providing appropriate facilities for hand washing and disposal of used masks in a closed bin. So I guess our feeling on this, our early feeling on this, is that we think that masks would be appropriate in situations where obviously you are directed by relevant authorities to wear such masks. So obviously at the moment in New South Wales, there are a number of different settings where the general public are required to wear masks, and we think that that would correlate with obviously employees in those particular types of industries or environments that should be wearing masks in that situation. So there's an important point to note, though, and that is that wearing a mask doesn't change any potential liability or presumption for contracting COVID-19 at work. And I'll explain what that is in a moment and go through some of the industries where that is the case. So let's talk about vaccines now. So in terms of, can you require employees to vaccinate? Well, at this particular point, as you can imagine, there's been no precedent to date for COVID-19 vaccines being required for employees. This hasn't been tested in the courts yet or in the commission. Some of the legal experts out there are saying that it may be a fair and reasonable directive. Some are even going further to say that there might be a positive obligation to protect other employees and customers. The only case law that we have to rely on in this is quite sort of minimal. There was a case that goes back to actually 2020. It talks about an employee who refused a flu vaccination in a childcare setting and was dismissed from that particular childcare facility. Now, unfortunately, the case was dismissed on procedural grounds, simply that it was out of time. So the Fair Work Commission has a time frame. You must lodge an application of 21 days, and that application wasn't lodged within that time. So it's a real shame, because it would have given us, I think, some decent insight into how the Commission may interpret these things and give us some guidance on COVID-19 vaccinations. And one thing that was interesting, though, is that the Deputy President, despite dismissing the matter on procedural grounds, the Deputy President indicated that both sides of the argument were at least equally arguable. So what that's saying to me is that, well, the employees' argument that they didn't want to take the vaccine, the flu vaccination in this particular case, wasn't frivolous, and that there was some argument to be put to the Commission. So that's very interesting. So that's saying that, at the very least, that if someone refuses a COVID-19 vaccine, it's likely not to be a black and white situation, and that there's going to be a case to be had in the Commission or in an alternative jurisdiction, of course. So the early signs of as well are that medical reasons and allergies will be factors in determining whether or not telling an employee to take a vaccine is a valid and reasonable directive. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Another grey area is going to be whether or not there are religious reasons for refusal, because there may be some religions that may take the view that a vaccination, depending upon what's in the vaccination, could be, inconsistent with their religious beliefs. I've also added in here political beliefs or reasons, and some people might sort of, think, what do you mean political beliefs? But I think there is a growing number of people who see this as a political issue, that see COVID-19 restrictions, vaccine, how the virus came about as being a political issue, and that their opposition to taking the vaccine may very well be a political one, not necessarily a religious one. So be interesting to see how that plays out. Obviously, we think the religious argument would be a better argument for not taking a vaccine than a political one, and I'll be very interested to see how that plays out the first time that is tested. So again, should be very interesting to see how this all happens. Let's move on to, this is a very interesting slide, and this is about the presumption of contracting COVID-19 at work for the following industries. And this was information that we obtained from the Workers' Compensation Independent Review Office, WIRO, in New South Wales. So what this is basically saying is that if you contract COVID-19 and if you work in any one of these industries, the presumption is that you have contracted COVID-19 at work. So the assumption is that if you've got COVID-19, you work in these occupations, that you got it at work for the purposes of liability and so on and so forth. So at the moment, the list includes the retail industry, the healthcare sector, police and emergency services, firefighters, ambulance officers, educational institutions, the cleaning industry, the construction industry, restaurants, clubs, hotels, disability and aged care, refuges, halfway houses and shelters, passenger transport services, courts and tribunals, correction and detention centres, places of public entertainment or instruction. So those industries, if you work in those industries, you contract COVID-19, the presumption is that you contracted it there. There is something that balances off against this, though, and at this point, with the numbers are frankly being really, really low across the country. I mean, I've got to say that the restrictions we have across the country at the moment imposed by the state premiers are very, very questionable when you look at what is going on in terms of the numbers. I mean, we are talking single-digit numbers, across the states for daily new cases that are locally acquired. And really, when you consider that, foreign ones will always be quarantined, there is very, very small exposure at the moment for COVID-19 to be spread within the community. So why I tell that story is that at the moment it's not going to be very difficult to do contact tracing for COVID-19 cases. I mean, obviously, when we had some significantly higher numbers in Victoria, I think we got up to 700 in a day, back in 2020 at some point. Might be more difficult to determine the exact source of the virus being contracted, but at the moment, with such low case numbers, even with the presumption that you can contract COVID-19 in those environments, it would not be difficult to have contact tracing, which could actually prove otherwise. So if you, for example, worked in the healthcare industry, but you contracted COVID-19 at a restaurant on that night, it wouldn't be very difficult to trace back to that particular restaurant if that was, in fact, the place in which COVID-19 was contracted. So the only other thing I would say on this is that there may be subsequent claims that may come from contracting COVID-19, such as mental health. And also there is some situations across, I guess, we've seen across the world where there's been a lasting effect of the COVID-19 virus on a particular person with ongoing respiratory problems and things like that. So you would expect that in most situations, COVID-19 would be contracted and there's a recovery, or certainly in 98, 99% of cases. But in others, there may not necessarily be, and there may also be liability for other things such as mental health problems. So that is a bit on the presumption of contracting COVID-19 at work. So I guess, look, I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of summarise our thoughts on this. So first of all, look, the efficacy of the vaccination is still unknown. Will there be potential future liabilities for unknown side effects? I mean, this is a real risk in all of this. I mean, we've got some businesses that are chomping at the bit to mandate vaccinations, and I think that should be taken with great caution, because certainly what we're seeing at the moment is that certainly the AstraZeneca virus or the vaccine, should I say, they're talking about in Australia, they're talking about a 62% effectiveness rate. They're saying that might not be enough for herd immunity and things like that. So again, whether the government will turn its mind to a different vaccine or not is kind of irrelevant, really, because it comes down to, will there be side effects from the vaccine ultimately? Now, again, even if you do vaccinate your employees, or even if you are required to vaccinate your employees because of what industry you are in, that's not going to change the presumption of liability for workers' compensation. And that if those workers still contract COVID-19 in the workplace, or they contracted and the source is unknown, the presumption of liability will still be there. Should the federal government not mandate the vaccine for your industry, I guess our early view is that you are likely taking on additional risk in that situation. So I would be cautious again with clients to not overreach on this, that if the government says that you need to vaccinate in your industry, well, your hands are probably going to be tied, and I'd be reluctant to go any further than that. So there's no need to take an individual stance on these particular matters as an employer beyond what the government is directing. So again, back on vaccinations, there could be an argument of more downside than upside, the potential risk of unknown side effects versus the risks of not doing so. And in Australia at the moment, we are fortunate the case numbers are so low that you almost a better chance of winning a lotto ticket than you are contracting COVID-19 right now in Australia. So again, something for employers to consider there. Obviously, the damage to industry has been, considerable. So, and again, this is all going to tie into what's going to happen with JobKeeper. Will JobKeeper be continued again? Or will the state premiers be finally forced to actually open up their states for business? We're going to see that in the coming months. Look, our position at this particular point for clients is that we'll only be advising clients to require masks and vaccinations in situations where it's aligned with directives from the state or federal governments. And I say that requiring masks and vaccines is because, look, again, I don't know what your personal observations of wearing masks are, but certainly from my perspective, I mean, I often feel, it's far more difficult to breathe walking around with a vaccine on than it is without one. So again, if your industry requires it, sure, but if it doesn't, well, there's no need to necessarily go anything beyond what the government is requiring for the specific industries that we've outlined. So that is where things are up to. So that is basically it for today's presentation on masks and vaccinations in the workplace. I hope you got something out of that today, and I hope that gave you some real guidance on how you should be considering these issues. I'll just leave the line open for another 30 seconds to a minute for individuals to ask any questions or make any comments about this particular issue before we close. But yeah, look, it's going to be certainly something that's going to be very interesting in 2021. How far will the governments go? How many industries will they require this from? We are seeing a growing level of requirement from government. It sort of seems very odd that in New South Wales, for example, with the case numbers being much lower than they even were in 2020, why now in terms of requiring masks in shopping centres and various other locations when that was not the case in 2020? So there's that factor. And that could be a sign of things to come from the governments that we may see, not only in New South Wales, but in other states. So something there about that. Steve, thanks for watching today's coverage. Would love to have a chat with you about these topics and your thoughts on those as well. Thanks for joining in. And thanks for everyone else who joined in today to talk about these things. Really appreciate your coverage and you're coming to listen to these HR Fridays. We'll continue to have thought-provoking topics in the coming weeks. But for now, look, it's Clint Indrell, Managing Director of On Demand HR. Goodbye and enjoy your weekend. Thank you again.